In Washington, amid the intensification of the war in the Middle East, it was decided to lift sanctions on Russia's main partner, Belarus. Today, the American president's envoy, John Cole, arrived in Minsk and met there with the local dictator, Alexander Lukashenko, as part of a mission aimed at negotiating the release of political prisoners. During the meeting, Lukashenko stated that he wants to talk about the war in Iran and Russia's war against Ukraine. Afterwards, Lukashenko's regime released 250 political prisoners, but as you can understand, Lukashenko did not do this just like that or for free. Washington agreed to ease sanctions against the Belarusian financial sector, including Belinvestbank, as well as to lift all remaining sanctions from Belaruskali, the Belarusian potash company, and Agro-Roskvit. In fact, the US thus legalized the top method, bargaining with people's lives. Lukashenko openly says that he arrested hundreds of people, put them behind bars, and now he will gradually release them in exchange for lifting sanctions. But here it's worth taking a close look at the list of companies that had sanctions lifted today and remembering that the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz in the Middle East also led to a halt in fertilizer supplies. And in a way there's a certain logic to this, but let's figure it out. My name is Alexei Pichi, let's discuss this topic together. But before we start this episode, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, give it a like and leave any comment under this video. This really helps the YouTube algorithms recommend this episode to as many viewers as possible. Also, subscribe to my Telegram channel Peachy News. The link is in the description of this video. There we post breaking news as it comes in. Be patient, we'll break everything down step by step. Today, the envoy of the American president John Cole once again flew to Minsk and met there with the local dictator Alexander Lukashenko as part of a mission aimed at negotiating the release of political prisoners. That's its official name, at least. During the meeting, Lukashenko stated that he wanted to talk about the wars in Iran and Ukraine. Here is a quote from Lukashenko before the meeting began. I think that my point of view on global problems, especially on the situation in the Middle East, will be important for you since you are fighting against our friends. And I am ready to discuss this issue openly. In general, it is worth noting that Trump instructed Cole to try to free more than 1,100 Belarusians who are currently behind bars because of their political or human rights activities in Belarus. Previous negotiations led to the release of more than 100 political prisoners, including a Nobel laureate, Nobel Peace Prize winner Ales Bialyatsky, and opposition politicians Maria Kolesnikova and Viktor Babariko. Because of this, the US partially lifted sanctions on Belarus, and the problem is that this started a very dangerous process. Now, any dictator in the world knows very well that America still negotiates with terrorists who capture people and put them behind bars for political reasons. That's exactly what Lukashenko did. So you can arrest opponents and then demand that Donald Trump lift sanctions in exchange for their release. On the other hand, some analysts believe that in this way Washington also hopes to distance Lukashenko from Vladimir Putin to some extent. The Belarusian opposition considers this attempt pointless but expresses gratitude for the release of political prisoners. Lukashenko has already stated that a big deal is being prepared between the US and Belarus, but it will not be signed at the expense of relations with Russia. As a result, today the Belarusian dictator Alexander Lukashenko pardoned 250 people who were convicted of allegedly extremist-related crimes. Lukashenko's press service has now issued a statement, quote, "The president has made a decision to pardon a number of individuals convicted of extremist-related crimes. First and foremost, the head of state, traditionally, was guided by the principle of humanity. And of course, he took into account the appeals received from the mothers, wives, and relatives of the convicted individuals. But friends, this is such a cynical lie. Lukashenko released the prisoners because the United States of America lifted sanctions from Belarus again. The US is lifting sanctions against Belarus, specifically on banks and key enterprises, including the Belarusian potash company and Belaruskali. So we're talking about those enterprises, which produce potash fertilizers. A representative of Donald Trump stated that restrictions will be lifted from the Belarusian Ministry of Finance, the Development Bank of Belarus Belinvestbank, and those very enterprises producing fertilizers. So, in other words, the sanctions were lifted in such a way that Belarus could sell fertilizers to the West and receive payments for them without any sanctions. And here I need to explain why why there was such a rush to lift sanctions specifically from these Belarusian companies. The escalation of the situation in the Strait of Hormuz in the Middle East, a strategic maritime corridor between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, through which about 20% of all the world's oil passed, also sparked a wave of concerns about the planet's food security. The thing is, not only oil and gas are transported through the Strait of Hormuz, but also huge volumes of other goods. And now, thanks to the Iranian crisis, China is gradually turning into a global monopolist in the fertilizer market. Now, as they say, watch closely. The countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council, particularly Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Oman, are key suppliers of 2 out of the 3 most important plant fertilizers. First of all, these countries account for about a quarter of the world's urea exports. This is a nitrogen fertilizer that stimulates the growth of leaves and stems. Secondly, these countries play another and even more significant role in the production of phosphate fertilizers. The production of phosphorus requires sulfur, which is obtained from oil and gas, and 1/3 of all such sulfur in the world comes from the Middle East. Phosphorus is one of the 3 key nutrients for plants, along with nitrogen and potassium. Without a sufficient amount of these elements in the soil, it's impossible to get a normal harvest of grains, vegetables, and fruits. That's why Trump is in a hurry to release Belarusian potash onto the world market, to at least partially cover the global fertilizer shortage. But, and I have to point this out, here Trump is once again hitting his own ally, because Canada is the dominant player in the global potash market, and it is Canada that could now cover the shortage. But Trump decided to let Belarus onto the market. But it's also important to remember that statements about mass hunger are exaggerated. Let me remind you, Russia, despite the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, has remained the world's largest exporter of fertilizers, and the sanctions have not changed that. Fears about mass hunger after 2022 turned out to be exaggerated. The global level of hunger has somewhat decreased since 2022, not increased, so the current crisis is certainly serious but not catastrophic. But this is a great reason to lift sanctions on Lukashenko. On the other hand, Trump doesn't want to let China profit from the crisis in the Middle East. As of today, China produces 13% of the world's potash supply. So, rhetorically, lifting sanctions on Belarus can be explained by the crisis in the Middle East. But in reality, even without Belarusian fertilizers, the world did not die of hunger and would not have died this time either. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you found this episode interesting and useful and you want to support our YouTube channel, you can do so financially through any donation, subscription, or membership on YouTube. It's easy to do. All links and details are in the video description, or just click the subscribe button below and become a member or scan the QR code on your screens. This is the most convenient way to support our channel with a one-time donation. I will be grateful for any support you give. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.